Ethan had always believed his childhood home was more than just a structure of wood and stone. It was the heart of his family's history. Every brick seemed to echo with voices of the past. The wooden floors still creaked in the same familiar spots where he and his sister used to run barefoot during long summer nights. The kitchen carried the faint scent of cinnamon, as if his mother's apple pies lingered in the walls. Out in the yard, the barn stood tall, though weathered, its beams strong with the effort his grandfather had poured into them decades ago. And towering above all else was the oak tree, its branches sprawling across the sky, a silent guardian that had watched over birthdays, weddings, and quiet moments of grief. It was under that oak tree that Ethan had promised his sister, years ago, that they would never let the house go. "This place is us," she had whispered, her small hand clutching his as they stared at the stars peeking through the branches. Now, years later, those words haunted him. The envelope came on a Wednesday morning, tucked into the mail slot like any other piece of paper. Ethan almost ignored it, but the bold block letters on the front, homeowners association notice, caught his attention. He carried it inside, tore it open, and felt his chest tighten as he read. The letter was sterile, written in clipped, impersonal language. "Violation of community standards," it read across the top. His barn was deemed an unauthorized structure. The shutters, painted in deep blue by his mother's careful hands, were called non-compliant. Even the oak tree was labeled a hazard that needed to be removed immediately. To make matters worse, the bottom of the page carried a threat. Failure to comply within 30 days will result in fines of $500 per day, and potential foreclosure action will be pursued. For a long moment, Ethan sat at the kitchen table, staring at the paper as the evening light filtered through the curtains. His hands gripped the letter so tightly that the edges began to crumple. The house was quiet, but in that silence, he heard echoes, the laughter of family dinners, the sound of rain pounding against the roof during storms, the way his father's deep voice had once carried across the halls. How could anyone look at this place and see only violations? He wandered the house slowly as though he were seeing it for the first time. In the living room, the faded wallpaper still bore faint pencil, marks where his mother had tracked his height as a boy. In the hallway, his father's handiwork showed in the smooth curve of the staircase railing, polished by years of hands sliding over it. Upstairs, in his childhood bedroom, he found the little carved initials in the window frame, his and his sister's, etched with a pocket knife when they were too young to know better. Every corner was alive with memory, and the thought of losing it all to HOA bureaucracy sent a wave of anger through him. That night, unable to sleep, Ethan climbed into the attic. Dust rose as he opened boxes stacked high with the remnants of the past. He found his grandfather's tools, still marked with scratches from decades of work. He discovered photo albums filled with images of block parties, where neighbors once gathered in the backyard, laughing and sharing meals. One picture showed the barn decorated with lights, hosting a wedding that nearly the entire town had attended. Another showed children, including Ethan and his sister, playing hide-and-seek under the oak tree's wide branches. Then came the letters, old yellowed envelopes tied together with twine. His grandfather's handwriting sprawled across the pages, filled with notes about how he had built the barn, with my own 2 hands and the help of good neighbors. The pride in those words was unmistakable. Ethan sat back, the weight of the papers and photos pressing on his chest. This wasn't just a home. This wasn't just land. It was the record of a family that had endured, grown, and contributed to a community long before the HOA ever existed. As the clock ticked past midnight, Ethan walked out onto the porch. The night air was cool, and the oak tree stood tall against the moonlight. He looked at its branches and thought of everything it had sheltered. His grandparents, his parents, himself, his sister. The HOA could threaten him with fines. They could call his heritage non-compliant, but they couldn't erase the roots that went deeper than their rules. For the first time since receiving the letter, Ethan felt clarity. He realized the fight wasn't just about money or compliance. It was about preserving the very soul of his family's legacy. The HOA saw property lines and guidelines, but Ethan saw the story of generations carved into every beam, every leaf, every memory. He folded the notice carefully and slipped it into the family album. as though filing it away among the proof of everything that came before. Then, standing tall on the porch, he whispered into the night, "They don't know me. They don't know this house. And they don't know what I'm willing to do." A spark had been lit inside him, something stronger than fear. It was determination. And with it came a quiet promise. The HOA might have started a battle, but Ethan had a plan they would never see coming. The next morning, Ethan woke with determination coursing through him. The letter from the HOA wasn't just a notice, it was a challenge. He couldn't shake the image of his grandfather's handwriting from the night before. Those proud words about building the barn with his own hands. That memory, paired with the weight of the oak tree standing tall outside, gave Ethan the courage he needed. But courage alone wouldn't stop the HOA. He needed a plan. Ethan started by reaching out to people who remembered his family. Not the board members who hid behind polished conference tables, but the neighbors who had once shared pie in his mother's kitchen or danced in the barn during summer nights. He began making quiet visits around the neighborhood, stopping by old friends' homes. At Mrs. Jennings' house, a widow in her 70s, Ethan knocked nervously on the door. When she saw him standing there, her face softened with recognition. "Oh, Ethan," she said, her voice warm. "You're the spitting image of your father. What brings you here?" Ethan explained the situation, showing her the notice and describing how the HOA wanted to strip the ranch down to fit their standards. Mrs. Jennings's hands shook as she read the letter. "This isn't right," she whispered. "Your family gave more to this neighborhood than anyone. Why, I still remember the winter your parents let my family stay in the barn when our heater broke, and now they're calling it a violation?" Her support gave Ethan hope. She promised to stand with him, even offering old photographs that proved how much the ranch had meant to the community. One by one, Ethan visited others. The Carters, who remembered borrowing tools from his grandfather's shed. The Thompsons, who recalled the summer when Ethan's mother organized a block party for everyone. Even the younger families who had only heard stories about the Carson house with the oak tree. With each conversation, Ethan felt the weight of history grow heavier. Not as a burden, but as a shield. Still, the HOA was not blind to what was happening. A week later, Ms. Calloway herself appeared at Ethan's door. Dressed sharply in a pressed blazer, clipboard in hand, she stepped onto the porch as though she already owned it. Her eyes narrowed at the peeling paint, the weathered barn, the sprawling oak tree casting shadows across the yard. "Mr. Carson," she began, her tone clipped, "I've been informed you've been stirring unnecessary concern among the residents. Let me make this clear. No amount of nostalgia will exempt you from the rules. Your property is in violation. If you do not comply, the board will pursue legal action. You have 20 days left." Ethan held her gaze. "This land has stood longer than this HOA has existed. You can't erase history just because it doesn't fit your image." For a moment, something flickered in Ms. Calloway's eyes. Annoyance, maybe even doubt, but she quickly masked it with a tight smile. "Rules are rules, Mr. Carson, and history doesn't pay the bills." She turned on her heel and walked away, her heels clicking against the pavement like a gavel striking wood. Her words rattled in Ethan's chest, but instead of discouraging him, they only deepened his resolve. That night, he gathered the photographs, letters, and memories he had collected from neighbors and began organizing them into a presentation. His idea was simple but bold. If the HOA wanted to call his home a violation, he would prove that it wasn't just his home. It was a cornerstone of the community. He would turn his family's ranch into something greater, something untouchable. The barn became his starting point. By day, Ethan worked tirelessly, repairing beams, cleaning out decades of dust, and restoring it into a space that could hold gatherings again. By night, he sketched ideas for what he wanted the property to become: a heritage center, a living monument to the families who had built the neighborhood long before strict rules and regulations took hold. Neighbors began stopping by, curious at first. When they saw what Ethan was doing, some offered to help. The Carters donated lumber. The Thompsons brought paint. Mrs. Jennings insisted on bringing homemade meals to keep him going. What started as Ethan's personal fight was slowly becoming a community effort. But the HOA wasn't blind to this transformation. Notices kept arriving in the mail, each one more aggressive than the last. One evening, Ethan opened a letter that froze him in place. The board had scheduled a formal hearing. If he didn't comply by then, foreclosure proceedings would begin immediately. The weight of the letter pressed hard against him. For the first time, doubt crept in. Could he really stand against the entire HOA? Did he have enough time? Enough strength? He sat on the porch that night staring at the oak tree. Its branches reached upward, defiant against the wind, unbending. That's when he realized this wasn't about winning or losing. This was about standing tall, like the oak tree, no matter the storm. Ethan folded the notice, placed it neatly beside the others, and whispered to himself, "They think they've cornered me. They think this is the end, but they don't know what's coming." The stage was set. The hearing loomed ahead, and Ethan knew the battle for his childhood home was about to reach its breaking point. The silence inside the old house was louder than any storm. Every creak of the wooden floorboards echoed memories, laughter at the dinner table, hushed whispers before bedtime, the sound of a family that once filled every corner of this place with love. Now, it was just him standing there, staring at walls that had seen decades of his family's history, and the thought of losing it all to the HOA felt unbearable. But he also knew something that the HOA didn't, something they never expected. For years, they had underestimated him, treating him as if he were just another voice they could silence, another property owner they could pressure into submission. They believed their rules, fines, and intimidation would be enough to break him. But they forgot one important detail. This wasn't just a house. It was his childhood home. It was the very foundation of who he was, and he had no intention of letting anyone erase that legacy. As the HOA moved forward with their plans, confident they had the upper hand, he quietly put his own strategy into motion. He had spent weeks gathering documents, tracing the property's history, and uncovering details even his parents had long forgotten. The land wasn't just valuable, it was protected. Decades ago, his grandfather had secured a preservation clause on the property that ensured certain areas couldn't be touched or repurposed. It was buried deep in the paperwork, overlooked by everyone. But to him, it was a lifeline. The hook came when he realized he could do more than just fight back legally. He could build something on the property that would make it untouchable, something so rooted in history, so connected to the community, that the HOA's reach would stop cold at the edge of his fence. He reached out to old friends, neighbors who had watched him grow up, and even local officials who understood the importance of preserving history. Piece by piece, he began to rebuild, not just the house, but the land around it. He planted a garden where his grandmother once had hers, restored the old barn into a community gathering space, and placed a marker on the property, honoring the generations that had lived there before him. It wasn't just about saving his home, it was about creating something greater, something no one could take away. When the HOA board finally returned, expecting resistance but also expecting defeat, they were stunned. Instead of a man beaten down by their rules, they found a movement. The neighbors they had once kept at a distance were standing alongside him, supporting his cause. Local media had even picked up the story, framing it as a fight not just for a house, but for history, family, and community values. The HOA, who thrived on silence and compliance, suddenly found themselves exposed in the light of public scrutiny. The tension reached its peak when the board attempted one final push. They issued notices, threatened more fines, and even brought their lawyer to intimidate him. But this time, it wasn't just his voice that answered back. It was the voices of dozens of others. Neighbors stood in his yard, reporters covered the standoff, and officials reminded the HOA that their authority had limits. The board, once so powerful, now looked small, cornered by the very people they were supposed to represent. As the dust settled, it became clear that the HOA's fight was over. They could no longer erase his family's legacy, nor could they ignore the strength of the community standing behind him. The house, the land, and the memories tied to it were safe. But even more importantly, he had built something they couldn't touch, a symbol of resilience, unity, and love that would outlast any rule or regulation. Looking at his childhood home, now alive with laughter and life once again, he realized the truth. The HOA had tried to take everything from him, but in doing so, they had unknowingly given him a gift. They had pushed him to honor his family's past in a way he never would have otherwise. And as the sun set behind the old house, casting long shadows across the yard, he knew this was more than a victory. It was a promise. A promise that no matter how hard others tried, some things could never be taken away.